Welcome to Module 3. This is where we get to answer the question, how much is this thing going to cost? All the work you've done so far by laying out your results chains, identifying specific activities, and developing a work plan will set you up to have a fairly realistic idea of what it will take to implement your project as planned. Developing a solid budget is an important step to inform your fundraising and determine when and how your team should proceed. Now that you have your work plan developed, it's time to develop a budget based on that work plan. In this module, you'll learn how to use your high-level work plan to estimate staff costs and other project expenses using both activity-based and strategy-level estimates. By the end of this module, you'll be able to demonstrate the following skills. Describe when to use activity versus strategy-level budgeting, and which cases each is useful. Estimate costs of activities or strategies based on the human resource efforts needed. Or estimate overall costs of activities or strategies based on knowledge and experience. Identify the staff, travel, equipment, and other main costs associated with each strategy. Identify important costs that are often overlooked, like indirect costs and overhead. And finally, use Miradi's budgeting feature to develop budgets from work plans. Okay, let's jump into it. Budgeting and financial management are critical to good conservation practice. So knowing the principal components of a budget and some tricks of the trade for making them can really come in handy for your projects. So let's see where we're at in our conservation standards cycle. In the first module, you got a refresher on the first two steps of the conservation standards, assess and plan. In the second module, we started getting into step 3 and covered developing a work plan and timeline. Now, as we said, we're going to focus on developing and refining a budget, building off of our work plan. So another view of the implement step, back at our drawing board, we are here at step B. And again, because this is our first pass, we're working on a high-level budget. In Module 2, when you were developing a high-level work plan, you learned about how you can estimate level of effort at an activity or a strategy level. So let's think about how we can use that high-level work plan to come up with a high-level budget for our coffee-making strategy. You may recall that for your coffee-making strategy, your main activities were to go to the market to buy the beans, then you grind them, boiled the water, poured it over the grounds, got out the cream and sugar, and poured the coffee. When thinking about the budget for this strategy, you might think of some obvious costs like the coffee beans. Let's say they cost about 25 pesos. What other costs might there be? How about your cream and sugar? Those cost 10 pesos. Let's assume you walk to the market, so you don't have any gas to include in your budget. You might be tempted to think that your budget will just be 35 pesos. But wait, isn't your time worth something? Let's say you make 100 pesos per hour. We know from the work plan that you plan to spend 1.25 hours shopping for and preparing your coffee. So your time alone is worth 125 pesos. And for the sake of simplicity here, let's assume that this is the only cup of coffee that you're making with those beans. Okay, so adding material costs, that's your beans, your cream, and your sugar, and then your human resource costs, that's you. Your total is 125 for you and your labor, 25 for the beans, 10 for the cream and sugar, so 160 pesos in total. To add a little twist to this, if you use your cream and sugar for other purposes, for example, baking, then you would probably consider them as other costs that you could not directly charge to the coffee strategy. Similarly, you wouldn't charge the gas you use to boil the water for your coffee making strategy either. This is a cost you would want to distribute over your coffee making, baking, and other relevant strategies. We'll talk more about how to deal with these different types of costs as we dive into the details of budgeting. Okay, again, we'll go into the details in a moment, but for now, I want to summarize the main steps in developing a high-level budget. First, let's think about the costs directly associated with each strategy or activity. These include the staff costs associated with your level of effort estimates. So in that coffee making example, your time was 1.25 hours and you made 100 pesos per hour. So that staff cost was 125 pesos. The second step is to add any materials or resources or other expenses directly related to implementing the activity or strategy. So in the coffee making example, your other expenses were the cream and sugar, which cost 10 pesos. I also want to highlight another way to calculate the activity costs is to simply estimate the cost based on a solid understanding of what's involved. So maybe you've been making coffee every morning for the past 10 years and you know exactly how much it costs, and that's 160 pesos. If that's the case, you do not need to break down the strategy into so many components and estimate the level of effort and associated costs for each component. You can just give the overall estimate if you have that rich experience. After you've estimated strategy or activity-specific costs, you should also determine if there are other expenses that are necessary for your overall project, but that don't quite fit under one specific strategy. These are what we call your other costs. They include major expenses like equipment and vehicles. So for the coffee making strategy, this might include the stove where you boil your water or the refrigerator where you store your cream. While you need a stove and refrigerator for your coffee making strategy, you probably use them for other things. So you can't charge them only to that coffee making strategy. Other costs also include general operating costs or overhead. This might include things like the water or gas you use in the house or apartment you live in. You use all of this in your coffee making, but they are indirect costs not directly related to making the coffee. Okay, so let's dive into some more conservation relevant examples. But first, can we take a moment to appreciate this hippo? Yeah, it looks really happy. Okay, that's all. Let's go back to our campaign to influence shark fin soup demand. Before getting into the details, I'll point out that we'll be planning our high-level budget at yearly intervals to match the high-level work plan timeframe. Okay? All right, so our first step is to use our work plan to determine funding needed for staffing. We can do this at the activity level and roll up all of your activities to the strategy level, or we can do a single calculation at the strategy level. Which you choose will depend on how you did your work planning. In this example, you'll calculate your budget at an activity level, specifically the Implement Outreach Campaign activity. Here we can see that Anna and Elena are programmed to spend 12 days total on this activity. Taking into account their individual daily rates, the staff costs associated with this activity are $1,000. You can use formulas in a spreadsheet to do these calculations. We could also look at the costs within the activity to see that Anna will cost a total of $400. This number comes from the 8 days of effort for this activity multiplied by Anna's daily rate of $50. While Elena will cost $600 because she is working fewer days, 4 in total, but her daily rate is higher than Anna's, so she'll cost the activity a little bit more. So we've now calculated staff costs for a single activity, and we would do this for all staff across all activities. Where we did staff estimates at the strategy level, we would do the same thing. At the end of this, we would then have a sense for the staff total costs across the project. Okay, the second piece to our budget puzzle is to think about any other expenses directly associated with your activities or strategies. In the coffee making example, the beans, cream, and sugar represented these other expenses. In the shark fin soup example, we have some other expenses that are specific to this strategy. Those include travel expenses for a meeting, as well as travel costs to sites to collect data. This second cost is associated with monitoring the effectiveness of the campaign. It's important to think about implementation and monitoring expenses when you're planning out your budget as well. So using this process, your budget will reflect staff costs and expenses specific to implementing your strategies and activities. Sometimes we know how much a strategy or activity costs, and we don't need to go through the steps of assigning people and hours to the strategy or activity. Instead, we can just estimate the total cost. In this example here, the team plans to contract a company to eliminate rats. That company provided them with a quote indicating the total will be $35,000, with the bulk of the expenditure happening early on. So in this case, the planning team doesn't need to detail out the level of effort. They can just put the monetary costs in because they have that direct quote from that company. You might also just estimate monetary costs for strategies or activities that you have a lot of experience with. So for your high-level budget, this might be sufficient to help you develop a realistic estimate. Okay, so far we have calculated staff costs and added expenses directly associated with our strategies or activities. Now we need to think about those other major expenses. These tend to be things like vehicles, computers, printers, or software. They're items you need to carry out your strategies and activities, but they're often also used for other work that you're doing. So remember in our coffee making example, the stove and refrigerator could be considered other major expenses. In this Broadern Eastern Bay project, these major expenses included computers and vehicles that will be used for all 5 of the strategies listed here. The final piece to estimating our budget is to include general operating costs or overhead. These costs include things like administrative salaries, your communication costs, office rental, and other non-capital expenses that aren't tied to a specific strategy. Many organizations calculate overhead as a percentage of the total budget, so you should be sure to check with your accounting staff and see how they handle these types of expenses. The important point is just to include them. It's easy to overlook these costs because they are not directly related to your project work, but they're very important to keep your organization running. With this final step, you should have all the information you need to develop your budget. In the next few slides, I'll share a few tips and reminders. We talked about including monitoring effort when we were developing a work plan. So if you included monitoring effort in your work plan, the costs associated with staff time to monitor should automatically transfer to your budget when you calculate staff cost. Still, it's worth a reminder that for your work plan and budget, you should include monitoring time and costs. Don't forget specific expenses related to monitoring either. For example, travel to conduct interviews or the purchase of GIS data. Your overall project budget might include some costs that were estimated at the activity level and some that were estimated at the strategy level. When you create your work plan and budget, you need to be sure that you're adding up effort and costs correctly. In this example, you can see that Anna's time for downloading and analyzing an FAO record will cost $150, and the purchase of the report will cost $600. The total cost of this monitoring activity is $750. Here, at the overall campaign strategy level, all the activities and associated expenses total $11,400. And for all 5 strategies, the budget is $264,050. Miradi is very useful because it calculates work units and other project expenses for you. And as we demonstrated earlier, it also has a handy roll-up function. But it's just one of several applications that you can use for budgeting. Many conservation teams use Excel. Here's that same view in Excel. Now I'll walk you through a few of the Miradi views just so you can see how to do it in Miradi's budgeting features. To start, first, you want to make sure that you specify your preferred currency under the Settings tab and then also the Financial Settings window pane. Now you're ready to start filling in your budget. Remember, you determined the work units in the previous module by adding or editing people involved, their required work units, and their rates. These show up here in yellow. The nice thing about Miradi is, if you have entered both the work units and the rates, Miradi will automatically calculate the staffing costs and enter the figures in the green area. Also, as you might recall, in Miradi, blue numbers can be edited. Black numbers are rolled up values that are calculated by Miradi. These can't be directly edited unless you remove the lower level entries. Okay, to create a new projected expense, you can right-click a strategy or activity in your table and then select Create Projected Expense. In this case, we'll add lodging as a new projected expense under Shark M3 monitoring activity. The new projected expense, lodging, shows up here I've added $500 for lodging for each trip to train and support local observers. Here again, you can notice that Miradi does the aggregation for you. It will add your new lodging expense to the existing travel cost expense and total it up at the activity level. Miradi will also then aggregate all activities to the strategy level and then all strategies to the project level. As always, you can find out more about Miradi and get support at miradi.org and on Miradi's YouTube channel. That concludes this module on high-level budgeting. Thanks for joining. From here, you'll continue to learn about how to use your work plan, budget, and your sense of likely resources to make decisions about how to prioritize what you work on first. In the next module, you'll learn how to make some choices and prioritize should your budget exceed your likely funding.